Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes is a classic of Spanish literature and among the most widely read books in world history. Cervantes' greatest work, Don Quixote, is a unique book of multiple dimensions. From the moment of its appearance it has amused readers or caused them to think, and its influence has extended in literature not only to works of secondary value but also to those which have universal importance. Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes tells the story of the eccentric Alonso Quixano, a man in his mid-50s, whose love for chivalric romantics leads him to assume the function of a knight-errant as he goes out on a noble quest to prove his valor to the world by reviving the culture of gallant horse-riding. The book is both tragic and comedic and follows the struggles of Alonso Quixano, whose adventure goes to prove that sometimes setting and following your dreams, against society's expectations, is the most worthwhile thing to do. Alonso Quixano is a man who loves chivalry romances so much that he goes a little insane. He renames himself Don Quixote de la Mancha and decides that he will ride off on his thin horse to be a knight. Though his armor is rusty, Don Quixote becomes a knight in a castle, actually an inn, and begins to perform chivalrous, knightly deeds. However, he is soon beaten up by some merchants and has to recover back at his home village. Concerned for their friend, the village barber and priest burn many of Don Quixote's chivalric romance books. The knight, however, believes that he is being targeted by evil enchanters, so he gets a squire, actually a peasant named Sancho Panza, to assist him. They set off, and the pair encounter many people with varied problems and entanglements. They fight with windmills that Don Quixote imagines are giants. After this, they stand up against traveling friars they take to be evil enchanters holding a woman captive, only leaving the travelers alone when the lady convinces the friars to play along and let Don Quixote win. Later the knight and squire even free galley slaves. More often than not, their interventions earn them scoldings and beatings, though the knight and squire duo do help a few couples to reunite. Eventually finding themselves in an inn full of people, misunderstandings, and apologies, the barber and priest find Don Quixote and take him home in a wooden cage, determined to put an end to his insane actions. Part 1 ends with Don Quixote doing poorly, both physically and emotionally. Have you ever heard the phrase, tilting at windmills, before? It refers to fighting imaginary enemies, and it comes from Don Quixote. It is inspired by Quixote tilting his lance to joust with windmills that he imagines are giants. Part 2 opens a month later. Don Quixote, now eager to ride again, finds out from a student named Carrasco that his adventures with Sancho have inspired a wildly popular chivalric romance novel. Their next mission is to find Don Quixote's love, Dulcinea, but there is no woman named Dulcinea. Sancho solves the contradiction by telling Don Quixote that a peasant woman they come across is actually the dreamy princess Dulcinea under a curse. Next, Don Quixote goes up against the Knight of the Forest and defeats him, though in reality it was Carrasco disguised, hoping to trick Don Quixote into returning home. The knight and squire continue to have a myriad of unlikely adventures. They eventually find themselves befriending a duke and duchess who are fans of the book made about them. However, they pull mean tricks on the chivalrous duo and take advantage of Don Quixote's state of mind. They even attempt to humiliate Sancho by making him a governor. They expect him, as a peasant, to be incapable of the job. However, Sancho is very intelligent and has a natural talent for leading. Still, it isn't long before Sancho longs to ride again with Don Quixote, so he gives up his position as governor. More adventures ensue, and new friendships are formed, and then Don Quixote battles the Knight of the White Moon. This is another of Carrasco's disguises. This time, he defeats Don Quixote and demands that the knight returns home. Don Quixote, now sorrowful and ill back in his home village, takes a long nap. When he awakens, he announces that he has regained his sanity. He is not Don Quixote anymore, and he even now hates chivalric romances. He is now Alonso Quixano the Good. He dies soon after this change of heart. Don Quixote is the ultimate idealist. He constructs a moral code built around unrealistic expectations and outdated beliefs, then he fully immerses himself in a fantasy world that soon becomes his reality. He turns a regular peasant woman into a virtuous, beautiful maiden worthy of being a knight's ladylove, and he sees castles in the frameworks of humble country inns. When things don't turn out as expected, he blames it on unseen magicians and their enchantments. Don Quixote's idealistic nature keeps him happy even when situations are less than desirable, such as in Part 1, Chapter 10, when he and Sancho Panza are forced to sleep under the stars. Every time this happened to him he thought himself, more conclusively, a true knight. The fallout from Don Quixote's idealism usually ends up on the shoulders of Sancho Panza, a realist by nature. Sancho Panza sees things as they are, not the way they should be, and unlike his master he doesn't see giants where windmills stand. His happiness is contingent on the meeting of basic needs, a full stomach, a comfortable place to sleep, and an easy journey. Unlike Don Quixote, Sancho Panza knows his own physical limitations. When they are surrounded by angry mule herds in Part 1, Chapter 15, Sancho Panza points out 2 men cannot take on a group of 20. That reasoning means nothing to Don Quixote, who says, "I'm worth 100. Both men end up beaten and battered. Cervantes doesn't support the idealism found in traditional chivalric romance novels, but he acknowledges that small doses of it have their use. Don Quixote's idealism is the incentive behind the adventure, but it is Sancho Panza's realism that allows them to continue the journey. Love is a common thread in Don Quixote, particularly in how it relates to marriage. In the various stories told throughout Part 1, love is presented as immediate and all-encompassing and as an excuse for bad behavior. Cervantes blames this perversion of what it means to be in love on the idea that chivalric romances were accepted as fact. For young men in particular, love is really nothing more than desire and wants nothing greater than delight, Part 1, Chapter 24. Yet after desire is sated, the love mysteriously disappears. That's because, in most cases, characters confuse lust for love. Don Quixote tries to be a flesh-and-blood example of a knight-errant in an attempt to force his contemporaries to face their own failure to maintain the old system of morality, the chivalric code. This conflict between the old and the new reaches an absolute impasse. No one understands Don Quixote, and he understands no one. Only the simple-minded Sancho, with both self-motivated desires and a basic understanding of morality, can mediate between Don Quixote and the rest of the world. Sancho often subscribes to the morals of his day but then surprises us by demonstrating a belief in the anachronistic morals of chivalry as well. In the first part of the novel, we see the impasse between Don Quixote and those around him. Don Quixote cannot, for instance, identify with the priest's rational perspective and objectives, and Don Quixote's belief in enchantment appears ridiculous to the priest. Toward the end of the second part, however, Cervantes compromises between these two seemingly incompatible systems of morality, allowing Don Quixote's imaginary world and the commonplace world of the Duke and the Duchess to infiltrate each other. As the two worlds begin to mix, we start to see the advantages and disadvantages of each. Sancho ultimately prevails, subscribing to his timeless aphorisms and ascetic discipline on the one hand and using his rational abilities to adapt to the present on the other. Distinguishing between a person's class and a person's worth was a fairly radical idea in Cervantes's time. In Don Quixote, Cervantes attacks the conventional notion that aristocrats are automatically respectable and noble. The contrast between the Duke and Duchess's thoughtless malice and Sancho's anxiety-ridden compassion highlights this problem of class. Despite his low social status, the peasant Sancho is wise and thoughtful. Likewise, the lowly goatherds and shepherds often appear as philosophers. In contrast, the cosmopolitan or aristocratic characters like the Duke and Duchess are often frivolous and unkind. Cervantes's emphasis on these disparities between class and worth is a primary reason that Don Quixote was such a revolutionary work in its time. Postmodern literature is concerned with narrative and the disruption of narrative, with the connection between naming and reality, and with fiction that self-reflexively calls attention to itself as fiction. By examining each of these in turn, readers may find that Cervantes anticipates the postmodern moment in Don Quixote. Don Quixote, then, is a work that continues to speak to its readers. Through its play with narration, its exploration of the power of naming, and its attention to metafictional concerns, the novel seems acutely appropriate for reading in the postmodern moment. Readers will also find much to interest them, for with each reading, the novel grows in richness and complexity.